If you clicked on this video, I'm willing to bet the house that you have not studied one bit for your upcoming SAT. Yep, that includes you in the back too. But don't worry, in this video, I'm not just going to give you a checklist of things that you have to study on your own. I'm actually going to show you everything, including teaching it to you, that you need to know for your upcoming SAT so that you don't totally flunk it. Now, before I get into any actual material, the number one thing that you should be prioritizing is sleep. If you don't sleep, you're not going to remember anything that I teach you anyway, and you're just going to feel groggy and you can't think. I know from personal experience that whenever I have little sleep, I just can't think straight. So make sure that you get at least 6 hours of sleep, but you really should be aiming for that 7 to 8 hour range. Even if that means clicking off this video and going to bed, do it. Okay, now I'm going to get into the actual SAT content, starting with the math section. Most of you probably know that there's four main topics on the math section. But what a lot of you don't know is that two of those sections make up 70% of the test, and one of those is literally middle school material. That's the one that I'm going to start out with, SAT Algebra. The first thing you need to know about are expressions. Expressions are combinations of numbers and variables, where if you plug in all the variables, you'll get some output. So this is an expression, a pretty simple one. This is also an expression, a little more complicated, and this is also an expression. We're getting a bit out there now. But the most common type of expression you're going to see on the SAT are linear expressions, which look like this. You're going to have your variable, it's going to be multiplied by some number, and then you're probably going to add another number. Now, sometimes expressions won't have any context, and you're just going to have to do different operations with them, which we'll talk about in the next section. But when they do have context, I like to think of expressions as writing one variable in terms of another. So let's say that I've read 8 pages so far this year, and I'm going to start reading 3 pages every day. Then, I could write the number of pages I read in terms of the number of days by saying that the number of pages I've read equals 3 times the number of days plus 8. Now, an equation is when you set one expression equal to a value or another expression. Again, there's some times where equations don't have any context and you just have to solve them. We'll talk about how to do that in just a second. But when they have context, I like to think that they do the opposite of what expressions do. So our expression is how we wrote the number of pages in terms of the number of days, but we're going to use an equation to figure out the number of days based on the number of pages. So let's say I want to figure out how many days it would take me to read 50 pages. Then I could set my expression of 3x plus 8 equal to 50, and now I have an equation to solve for the number of days. Now there are ways to solve equations manually, but you shouldn't be worried about any of those. On the SAT, you have Desmos, which means that all you have to do is just plug in your equation, and wherever it intersects the x-axis, that's your solution. So in our example here, the equation 3x plus 8 intersects the x-axis at 14, so our solution to the equation is 14 days. Now the next level is a system of equations where you have two equations and each equation has two variables. If you want to solve these equations, plug them both into Desmos, and wherever the two lines intersect is your solution. Sometimes the two lines are going to be parallel, which means that the systems of equation has no solution, and other times the two lines are going to overlap, which means that there's infinite solutions to the systems of equations. The last thing I'm going to talk about in the algebra section are inequalities. So the setup for an inequality is really similar to an equation, except that you're going to have a greater than or less than symbol instead of an equal sign. But that causes the solutions to be very different. So if we go over to the graph here, unlike the line, there's an entire shaded region that's above or below the line based on whether you have greater than or less than, and those are all solutions to the inequality as well. Now, if you have a system of inequalities, whatever the common region between them is the solutions to both. Now, if your sign for the inequality is greater than or less than, then the line is going to be dotted like this, and the line does not count as solutions to the inequality. But if the symbol is greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, then you're going to have a solid line like this, and the line are solutions to the equation. I also probably should mention that Desmos only recognizes x and y as variables. So if the problem used different variables, or you thought it'd make more sense to use different variables, then make sure to switch them before you plug it into Desmos. Alright, that's all there is for algebra, and it's time to move on to the next section, which is SAT Advanced Math. Now, unfortunately, Advanced Math has a lot of different topics in it, and we don't have that much time, so I'm only going to be covering the quadratics. If you're upset about that, maybe don't wait until the last day of the test to study. Alright, here's how the graph of a quadratic looks. You can think of it like a rounded valley, or maybe a rounded bottom of a hill, whatever you want to think. And there's three main types of points that you're going to want to recognize on a quadratic graph, and each of those different types of points relates to a way that we can write the equation of a quadratic. The first main type of point is the y-intercept, and that's where the quadratic intersects the y-axis. The y-intercept is important because it relates to standard form, which is when we write the equation with no parentheses or anything, just plainly as can be. Now, the y-intercept is equal to the c value in standard form. So in this case, the y-intercept is 5, and the c value of the quadratic is also 5. That's always true for any quadratic. The next main type of point that you're going to want to know are the zeros or the x-intercepts of the quadratic, and this is just where the quadratic hits the x-axis. So in our example, the x-intercepts or the zeros would be -5, 0, and -1, 0. So I should probably specify here. The x-intercepts would be -5, 0, and -1, 0, but the zeros would be -5 and 1. So the zeros of a quadratic are the numbers that we can plug in so that the quadratic equals 0. So if I plugged in -5 or -1 into our equation, the quadratic equals 0. These are important for factored form. So factored form is where we pull out the a coefficient, which is the coefficient for x squared, and then we do each of the zeros in a factor. So for the first factor, we'll start with -5. We would do x minus -5, which equals x plus 5. So if we plug in -5 to that, it's automatically going to be 0. Then we do the same thing for -1. So we do x minus -1, so it ends up being x plus 1. Then we finish writing our quadratic. Now, some very astute viewers might be wondering, if I move this quadratic up a little bit, wouldn't there be no zeros? And you'd be correct. If I move the quadratic up, it never intersects the x-axis, so there's no real zeros. We're not going to talk about imaginary numbers or anything like that in this video. There's also a possibility that there's only one zero. So if the quadratic just touches the x-axis at one point, there's only one zero, and we'd write the factor form by squaring the term with that zero. So let's say that the zero was at -3, I do x plus 3 squared. The last main type of point, or important type of point that you're going to want to recognize is the vertex of a quadratic. This is where the minimum of the quadratic happens. So the x-coordinate is where the minimum happens. So in our example, at x equals -3, that's when the quadratic is at its lowest. And the y-coordinate is the actual minimum of the quadratic. So in our example, the minimum is -4. Vertexes are important because we can use them to write a special form called vertex form. To write vertex form, just like the factored form, I'm going to pull out the a value, which is the coefficient of x squared. Again, in our example, it's 1, so it doesn't matter too much. Then, just like we wrote the factor, I'm going to do that for the x-coordinate of the vertex, and I'm going to square it. So in this case, I do x minus -3 squared, which equals x plus 3 squared. And then I'm just going to tag on the y-coordinate at the end. So it's -4, so I'm just going to do -4. That's our vertex form. We can use that to find the vertex easily. So if you ever see this form of a quadratic, you just make the number inside the parentheses negative, and then just take the number outside the parentheses, and you have your vertex. I'm sure a lot of you in the video had the burning desire to scream while I was saying all that. The quadratic can be the other way. I know, bro. I know. We're getting to that. Sometimes the quadratic can actually be flipped so that it looks like a mountain, and this is when the a value or the x squared coefficient is negative. So here, not much really changes, except that the vertex is actually the maximum of the quadratic, and it's going to go downwards. That's it. Everything else stays the same. That might have been a lot of new stuff, I know. So here's a quick summary. The y-intercept relates to standard form, the x-intercepts or the zeros relate to factored form, and the vertex relates to vertex form. Just memorize how those each look and why they're important, and you're good. I'm not going to go over the other two sections in this video too much because they're 30% of the test. But if I had to give you a few tips, just know what the basic measures of center are for problem solving and data analysis, along with the measures of range. Just look up what those mean if you don't know. And then be familiar with the basic types of charts. And then for the geometry section, there's a lot of area formulas on the front cover of the math section. Just read over those one time and understand what all of them mean. Unlike the math section, the reading section is a lot more evenly distributed, so there's not one obvious section to tackle just based on it being the majority of the test. But there's a pretty obvious easy half and hard half for each module. The first half is usually going to be your harder module, or I should say your harder half, and it takes a lot of time to learn. So in this video, I'm only going to be covering the second half of the modules, which is your grammar rules and then your transitions and your rhetorical synthesis. Again, if you're mad about it, maybe try studying earlier next time. The last part of the test is called SAT Expression of Ideas, or SAT Writing to be more simple. And I already made a whole video explaining that, so I'm not going to waste time explaining it again in this video. If you need help with this section, just go check that video out. It's only 4 minutes long. All right, that leaves us with SAT grammar, which is the last part that you're going to need to know for your SAT. There's 6 grammar rules that you're going to have to know. 5 of them are super simple. You'll understand them when I explain them once. And one of them is a little more complicated, but not too much. Okay, the first grammar rule I'm going to talk about is subject-verb agreement. And all that means is that when you have a singular subject, it should be paired with a verb that has an S. And when you have a plural subject, it should be paired with a verb that doesn't have an S. So for example, if I have a single person like Mark, I should say that Mark swims, or Mark trains, or Mark eats. Those are all verbs that have an S at the end. But if I had multiple people or multiple things, let's say the pigeons swim, the pigeons train, the pigeons eat. None of those verbs have an S at the end. So the way you're going to know you're dealing with a subject-verb agreement question is you're going to look at the answer choices and see a bunch of different verb forms. That might be a little bit confusing with another grammar rule that I'm going to talk about in a second. But the way you can be sure you're dealing with subject-verb agreement is that one verb is going to have no S and one verb is going to have an S at the end. So let's say all of the answer choices are versions of the verb swim. Then one of the answer choices will be swim and one of the answer choices will be swims. If you see that, you can be pretty sure that you're dealing with a subject-verb agreement question. The next grammar rule is really similar to the previous one. It's called pronoun antecedent agreement. And instead of trying to match a verb to a subject based on agreeing, you're going to match a pronoun to a subject based on whether they agree or not. So if you have a singular subject, you're going to choose a singular pronoun. And if you have a plural subject, you're going to choose a plural pronoun. If you see a bunch of different pronouns as your answer choices, you can be sure you're dealing with a pronoun antecedent agreement question. For both of the previous grammar rules, the hard part about the questions isn't that you have to choose a verb or a pronoun based on the subject. Once you figured out the subject, that part's actually really easy. The hard part is deciding what subject is the verb or the pronoun matching with. So there's going to be a bunch of different nouns in the entire passage, right? And you have to figure out which one applies to that verb or pronoun. So the best way I'd go about doing this is just try to plug in each subject into that blank and see if it makes sense. So let's say that swims is your verb. You have to see what nouns in the passage could actually swim and it would make sense. Same thing with the pronouns. So you're going to have a bunch of different nouns. Try plugging those in the blank and see if it would make sense. Okay, so the third grammar rule is where you might get confused with subject-verb agreement, and it's called verb forms. So this is basically just subject-verb agreement, but there's more rules involved. The nice part about these, though, is that the vast majority of verb forms questions are actually subject-verb agreement questions. So when you're looking at the answer choices and you see a bunch of different verb forms, if you see one that has no S and one that has an S, it's a subject-verb agreement question almost every single time. So that's the majority of verb forms questions. And out of the remaining types, the other majority, so the part that's left, the majority of those are really similar. So you're going to have, again, a verb with no S, and then you're going to have a verb that ends in a D for past tense. So if you're not dealing with a subject-verb agreement question, you're probably just dealing with present or past tense. So summarizing all that, the answer choice is probably going to be one of these 3 types of verbs. The next grammar rule is going to be possession or apostrophes. And the number one thing you want to remember is that nouns, an apostrophe shows possession, pronouns, an apostrophe shows no possession. So for example, if I said it's with an apostrophe, that would be short for it is. But if I said it's with no apostrophe, that would show possession. Okay. In nouns, an apostrophe before the S means that there's a singular subject, and an apostrophe after the S means there's a plural subject. To solve these questions, go word by word in the answer choices and ask yourself if each word owns the word after it or not. If it does and it's a noun, you can add an apostrophe, and if it's a pronoun, no apostrophe. Again, I want you to remember that you can own things that are not physical or something that you can hold. You can own feelings, you can own thoughts, you can own expressions, so on. Just make sure that you remember that you can own things that aren't physical. The last grammar rule that's super easy is modifiers, and modifiers are phrases without a clearly stated subject that are obviously describing something. So even though you can tell what they're describing based off the description, it doesn't say it clearly. And whatever they're describing in the sentence has to go right after the comma in the modifier. So you're going to have your modifier, then a comma, and then the subject has to go right after. The biggest trap with these questions is an answer choice that has the subject right after, but it's going to have an apostrophe in the subject, and that's going to change the subject of the sentence. So even though it's right after, the apostrophe causes something else to be the subject. So if you don't want to remember all that, just know that don't choose an answer choice with an apostrophe in it. Okay, Easy grammar rules down, we're on to the last part of this video and the slightly more complicated grammar rule, which is the one I know you're all dreading, punctuation. The two biggest traps when you're dealing with punctuation questions are when you're deciding whether to add a comma or not and recognizing run-on sentences. So for that first trap, don't add a comma unless you really feel there has to be separation between the two parts that you're adding the comma in between. So if everything before and after the comma are talking about the same point, don't add one. But if there is a transition to a different topic, then you should add one. Now, the second trap comes from not understanding what a complete sentence is. So, a complete sentence has a subject that's doing a verb. That could be a normal verb like swims, trains, runs, the stuff I was describing earlier. Or it could be a verb that you use to describe the subject. So, words like is, was, were, those all count as verbs too. And their sentence should be able to stand by itself as a complete thought. If it meets those three requirements, it's a complete sentence. So if you want to separate complete sentences, you have to use a period, a semicolon, a comma plus a fanboys conjunction, just look them up if you don't know them, or a colon. A colon is the one unique one out of those four because you only have to have a complete sentence before the colon in order to use it. So it doesn't really matter what's after. So if you're dealing with two complete sentences, you have to use those four or one of those four punctuations to separate them. After you choose your punctuation, just make sure to read the passage one time and see if you're dealing with two complete sentences. That's the most common way people get stuff wrong. They'll add a comma or something that doesn't separate two complete sentences properly. For the other two sections, even though I'm not going to go over them in this video, I do have three main tips that I want to give you. First of all, use the process of elimination. For most questions, that's probably going to be enough to get you the right answer. Second, look for what's wrong in your answer choices in general. It's a lot easier in hard SAT questions to pick out something that's wrong in an answer choice than it is to figure out why it's right. I always say go for the least wrong answer choice if you're in doubt. And the last one I'd give you is to watch out for overgeneralizations. So if an answer choice is trying to say that whatever point it's making applies to everything, or it uses words like all and every, I'd be skeptical about it. My bad. I'd be skeptical about that answer choice because usually when you're trying to generalize it to everything, it's probably wrong. All right, just like that, I don't know how long this video ended up being, but it's an SAT crash course that actually teaches you everything that you need to know and gives you the most bang for your buck in terms of time. Now make sure to review the stuff in the video if you haven't already and get some sleep, and you should be good for tomorrow's SAT. Good luck.